The chess club laughed when I joined, having no clue I was a grandmaster who'd beaten world champions. I walked into Lincoln High's chess club meeting on a Thursday afternoon in September, carrying a backpack and wearing clothes from Goodwill that didn't quite fit. The room smelled like old textbooks and teenage desperation to belong somewhere. 12 students sat around folding tables with cheap plastic chess sets scattered between them, and every single one looked up when I entered like I'd interrupted something sacred. The club president, a senior named Dominic Zhao, stood near the whiteboard where someone had written "State Championship or Bust" in red marker. He sized me up with the kind of look that said he'd already decided I didn't belong here, his eyes moving from my scuffed shoes to my faded jacket before settling on my face with barely concealed disdain. Dominic asked if I was lost, his tone suggesting he hoped the answer was yes. I said I wanted to join the chess club, and the room erupted in snickers. A girl with pink-streaked hair named Veronica Lim actually laughed out loud while covering her mouth like she was trying to be polite about it. Dominic exchanged glances with his vice president, a stocky kid named Trevor Banks, and asked if I even knew how the pieces moved. I said I knew a little about chess, and that made Trevor laugh so hard he had to wipe his eyes. He said they weren't a beginner's club, that this was serious competitive chess for students preparing for state and regional tournaments. He suggested I try the school library, where they had chess books for people learning the basics. I stood there letting them have their moment, because I'd learned over the past 3 months that explaining who I really was only made things harder. My name was Alexei Volkov, and I'd earned my grandmaster title at 14 after beating 3 world champions in tournament play across Europe. I'd competed in 12 countries, studied under Viktor Kovalenko himself, and had been ranked in the top 50 players globally by the time I was 16. But those credentials belonged to a different life, one that ended when my father got arrested for embezzlement and my mother moved us to this small Oregon town where nobody had ever heard of me, and I intended to keep it that way. The last thing I needed was the attention that came with people knowing I'd been a chess prodigy, because that attention had destroyed everything once before. Dominic said I could stay and watch if I promised not to distract the actual members. He pointed to a chair in the corner near the dusty trophy case that held exactly 3 tarnished awards from decades ago. I sat down and pulled out a notebook, pretending to do homework while watching them set up their games. Veronica played against a freshman named Kevin Park, who clearly idolized her based on how nervous he looked every time she spoke. Trevor challenged another senior named Aisha Rahman to what he called a grudge match from some previous game that hadn't gone his way. Dominic moved between tables offering advice in a voice loud enough to make sure everyone heard how knowledgeable he was about chess theory and strategy. Their games were mediocre at best. Kevin played scared, making defensive moves that any decent player would exploit within 10 moves. Veronica had memorized some openings, but clearly didn't understand the underlying principles because she kept forcing book moves even when the position called for something else. Trevor played aggressively, but with no real plan, just pushing pieces forward and hoping something worked. Aisha was actually competent, probably the best player in the room, but she kept second-guessing herself and missing obvious tactical opportunities. Dominic's advice was textbook stuff that showed he'd read about chess without really understanding it at a deep level. Watching them was like watching someone who'd learned to cook from reading recipes but had never developed actual culinary intuition. After 30 minutes, Dominic noticed me watching and asked if I understood what was happening in the games. I said it looked like standard positional play, and Trevor snorted with laughter. He explained in a condescending voice that they were actually employing advanced strategic concepts that would be way over my head. Veronica added that chess at their level required years of study and practice that someone like me probably couldn't appreciate. I nodded and went back to my notebook, writing down the position from Aisha's game and mentally calculating the forced mate in 7 moves that she was missing. Trevor's game would be over in 4 moves if his opponent saw the knight fork that was coming. Dominic was currently advising Kevin to make a move that would lose his queen in 3 moves. I wrote it all down and said nothing. The meeting ended with Dominic announcing that the regional qualifier was in 6 weeks and everyone needed to practice daily if they wanted to have a chance. He said Lincoln High hadn't sent anyone to state finals in 8 years, and this was their year to change that. Everyone nodded solemnly, like he'd just delivered a presidential address. As people packed up, Veronica noticed me still sitting there and asked if I'd be coming back. I said probably, and she exchanged a look with Trevor that clearly communicated they thought that was unfortunate. Dominic told me that if I wanted to join officially, I'd need to pay the $20 club dues and commit to attending all meetings and practice sessions. I said I'd think about it and left before anyone could ask more questions. My mom picked me up in our 15-year-old Toyota that barely ran, and she asked how my first day at chess club went. I said it was fine, and she caught the tone in my voice that meant it definitely wasn't fine. She asked if I'd told them about my background, and I said no, that we'd agreed I would keep that part of my life private. She looked relieved because she was still dealing with the fallout from my father's arrest, and the last thing she needed was reporters tracking us down because someone discovered that the disgraced oligarch's prodigy son was living in Oregon. We drove home to our tiny apartment in silence while I thought about whether hiding who I was had been the right choice or just the easier one. That evening, I set up my chessboard and replayed games from the World Championship matches I'd studied years ago. The pieces moved across the board in patterns that felt more like home than anywhere I'd lived in the past 3 months. Chess was the only thing that made sense anymore. The only place where the rules were clear and talent actually mattered instead of which family you came from or how much money your parents had. I'd lost my father, my home, my country, and my reputation, but I still had chess. Nobody could take away the patterns I'd learned, or the thousands of games I'd memorized, or the instincts I'd developed through years of tournament play. Those belonged to me, regardless of where I lived or what name people called me by. I went back to chess club the next week with $20 I'd earned washing dishes at a restaurant where my mom worked. Dominic took the money and wrote my name on a roster that had 12 other names already listed. He said they were doing a club tournament that day to determine seeding for the regional qualifier. Everyone would play everyone else in rapid games, 15 minutes per player, and rankings would be determined by points. The winner would get first seed and the honor of representing Lincoln High as their top player. He looked directly at me when he explained that this tournament was only for experienced players and maybe I should just observe since I was so new. I said I'd like to play, and Trevor laughed and said it was my funeral. The tournament started with me paired against Kevin for the first round. He set up the pieces and offered his hand, which I shook. He played the Italian game opening, and I responded with standard giuoco piano defensive setup, keeping everything simple and classical. Kevin played the first 10 moves from memory, but then started thinking hard when we reached the middle game. I'd already calculated the next 15 moves and knew exactly how the game would end, but I played slowly and carefully to avoid looking too confident. Kevin's position collapsed on move 18 when he moved his bishop to defend a pawn and walked straight into a knight fork he didn't see coming. He stared at the board for 2 minutes before resigning, his face red with embarrassment. Dominic watched my second game against a junior named Pablo Rivas, who played the Queen's Gambit with reasonable understanding of the opening principles. I declined the gambit and transitioned into a closed position that suited my style. Pablo was solid for about 12 moves before making a small positional error that let me gain a tempo advantage. I pressed the advantage carefully, trading pieces when it favored me, and keeping pieces when the position required it. By move 25, Pablo was in a losing endgame and he knew it. He resigned gracefully and shook my hand, saying that was some impressive play. Dominic stood nearby, frowning like he was trying to figure out if I'd just gotten lucky twice. My third game was against Trevor, and he came in talking about how he was going to teach me what real chess looked like. He played the King's Indian attack with the kind of swagger that suggested he thought this was his special weapon. I'd played against the King's Indian attack approximately 300 times in tournament settings and knew every major variation by heart. Trevor's version was textbook but mechanical, showing he'd memorized lines without understanding the ideas behind them. I let him build his attack while quietly improving my position, then launched a counterattack on the queenside that he never saw coming. His king was suddenly in danger, and all his pieces were on the wrong side of the board. He lasted until move 28 before resigning with a bitter expression that said he was already making excuses in his head. Veronica was next, and she set up the pieces with careful precision, lining up everything perfectly before starting the clock. She played the French defense with reasonable technique, getting through the opening without any major mistakes. The middle game was where she started struggling because the position required creative thinking rather than memorized moves. I offered a pawn sacrifice that opened lines toward her king, and she took 5 minutes deciding whether to accept it. She declined the sacrifice, playing it safe, but that just let me build my position even more. By move 23, her position was cramped and uncomfortable. She resigned on move 31 after I won her queen through a forced sequence she hadn't calculated. Aisha was my fifth opponent, and she was clearly the best player I'd faced in the club so far. She played the Sicilian defense with real understanding, getting an active position and creating genuine threats against my king. We reached a complex middle game where both sides had chances, and I had to actually think about my moves instead of just playing on autopilot. She found several good defensive resources and forced me to calculate carefully to maintain my advantage. The other club members gathered around to watch because this was actually a competitive game. I eventually won through a tactical sequence in the endgame, but Aisha had pushed me harder than anyone else here. She shook my hand afterward and said she'd enjoyed the game, her eyes showing real appreciation for someone who could play at her level. My sixth game was against Dominic himself, and the room went quiet when we sat down. He was undefeated so far in the tournament and clearly expected to win this easily. He played the Ruy Lopez with the confidence of someone who'd won with it many times before. I responded with the Berlin defense, which was considered the most solid defensive system against the Ruy Lopez. Dominic knew the main lines, but I took him into a variation that was slightly off the beaten path, one that I'd studied extensively with Victor years ago. He started thinking longer on each move, burning through his time while I played relatively quickly because I knew these positions cold. The middle game was equal, but only in material count. Positionally, I was slightly better, and that advantage grew with every move. Dominic's face got redder as the game progressed and his position deteriorated. He'd gone from expecting an easy win to fighting for a draw to just trying to survive. His time was running low, and he started making mistakes under pressure. I won a pawn, then traded into an endgame that was technically winning but required precise technique. Dominic tried some desperate tactics, but they were easy to refute. He resigned with 3 minutes left on his clock, standing up abruptly and walking away from the board without shaking my hand. Trevor asked where I'd learned to play like that, and I said I'd practiced a lot at my old school. Veronica looked suspicious and asked what school that was. I said it was in Europe and changed the subject by saying I needed to get to my next game. By the end of the tournament, I'd won all 12 games without losing a single one. The final standings had me at the top with 12 points, Aisha second with 9 points, and Dominic third with 8 points. The room was completely silent as Dominic wrote the results on the whiteboard, his hand shaking slightly with what I assumed was anger. Trevor said there was no way someone who just joined the club could be that good and demanded to know who I really was. Veronica pulled out her phone and started searching my name, but found nothing, because Alexei Volkov was too common a name, and my competitive chess history was buried under privacy settings my mother had paid a lawyer to implement after my father's arrest. Dominic called an emergency club meeting after everyone left except the core members. He said they needed to discuss whether I should be allowed to compete for Lincoln High at the regionals. Trevor argued that I was clearly too good for high school chess and must be lying about something. Veronica said it wasn't fair to the other clubs if they brought in a ringer who was obviously way above the competition level. Aisha, to her credit, said that if I was a student at Lincoln High and paid the club dues, I had every right to compete regardless of my skill level. Pablo agreed with Aisha and said they should be happy to have a strong player on their team instead of trying to exclude him. The debate went on for 20 minutes before Dominic finally said they'd vote on it. The vote was 6-4 in favor of letting me compete, with Dominic, Trevor, Veronica, and Kevin voting against me. Dominic said the decision was made, but I'd need to prove I was actually a Lincoln High student by showing my enrollment papers at the next meeting. He said it in a way that suggested he hoped I wouldn't be able to produce them. I said that was fine, and left, while hearing Trevor mutter that something about me didn't add up. I walked to the parking lot where my mom was waiting and told her that the club had voted to let me compete, but some of them were suspicious. She asked if I was sure this was a good idea, and I said chess was the only thing I had left from my old life, and I wasn't going to let it go. The next week, I brought my enrollment documents, and Dominic examined them like he was looking for forgeries. He finally admitted they looked legitimate and filed them in the club folder with obvious disappointment. He announced that the regional qualifier was in 3 weeks, and we'd be sending our top 6 players based on the club rankings. He'd be going as club president regardless of his ranking, which seemed like an abuse of power, but nobody challenged it. The practice schedule intensified to 3 times a week plus weekend sessions. During practices, Dominic separated me from the other strong players and paired me with beginners, saying I needed to help develop the weaker members. It was obviously intended to prevent me from getting quality practice, but I didn't argue. 2 weeks before regionals, a man in an expensive suit showed up at our apartment. He introduced himself as Lawrence Finch, a private investigator hired by my father's former business partners. He said they'd tracked us to Oregon and wanted to know if I'd be willing to testify about my father's business dealings. I said I'd been 14 when my father was arrested and knew nothing about his business. Finch said that wasn't what they'd heard, that there were records suggesting I'd been present at meetings and had access to financial documents. He handed my mother a subpoena, requiring me to appear for a deposition in 2 weeks, the exact same day as the regional chess qualifier. My mother went pale and told him to leave. After he left, she started crying and said she'd known this would happen eventually. I told my mom I wouldn't testify because I genuinely didn't know anything useful, and also because I suspected my father's partners were trying to use me to shift blame onto him for things they'd all done together. She called her lawyer, who confirmed that the subpoena was real, but said we could try to delay it since I was a minor and the case was complicated. The lawyer said it would cost money we didn't have, but he'd see what he could do. I asked about the chess tournament, and he said I'd probably have to choose between testifying and competing. My mom looked at me with exhausted eyes and said we'd figure something out, but I could see she didn't actually believe that. At the next chess practice, I played poorly because my mind was on the subpoena and what it might mean. Dominic noticed and made a comment about how I was showing my true colors now that the pressure was on. Trevor said maybe I'd just gotten lucky in the club tournament, and this was my actual level. I lost a practice game to Aisha because I blundered a piece in the middle game while thinking about lawyers and depositions. She asked afterward if I was okay, and I said I was fine, just having an off day. She didn't look convinced but didn't push it. That evening, I got a text from an unknown number saying, "We know who you really are," with a link to an archived news article about my father's arrest that mentioned me by name as his son. The article was in Russian, but had been translated using automated software that made it barely readable. It described my father as a chess-obsessed oligarch who'd pushed his son to become a grandmaster while secretly embezzling millions from his business partners. There was a photo of me at age 15, holding a trophy after winning a tournament in Moscow, my face younger, but unmistakably mine. The article speculated that I'd known about my father's crimes and might have even helped launder money through fake chess prizes. None of that was true, but the article had been published at the height of the scandal when newspapers were printing anything sensational. I showed the text to my mom, and she immediately called her lawyer, who said the privacy protections he'd set up had apparently been breached, and we should prepare for my identity to become public. The next day at school, someone had printed the translated article and posted copies on walls throughout the building. My Russian name was highlighted in yellow marker, and someone had written "Chess Club Fraud" across the top. I ripped down every copy I found, but there were dozens of them. Students I'd never spoken to stared at me in the hallways and whispered to each other. By lunch, everyone knew that the quiet kid who'd joined chess club was actually some disgraced Russian grandmaster whose father was in prison. Dominic found me in the cafeteria and said we needed to talk immediately. He looked angrier than I'd ever seen him. We met in an empty classroom with Trevor, Veronica, and the club's faculty advisor, Mr. Leopold. Dominic threw down a copy of the article and demanded to know if it was true. I said my father had been arrested, but I'd had nothing to do with his crimes, and the article's insinuations were false. Mr. Leopold asked if I was really a grandmaster, and I admitted that yes, I'd earned that title years ago. Trevor exploded and said I'd lied to everyone by not disclosing my background. Veronica said I'd been scamming the club by pretending to be a beginner when I was actually a professional player. Dominic said my presence violated the spirit of high school chess competition, and I should withdraw from the team immediately. Mr. Leopold, to his credit, said that lying by omission wasn't the same as fraud, and if I was a legitimate student at Lincoln High, I had the right to compete in sanctioned activities. He asked why I hadn't mentioned my background, and I explained that I'd wanted to leave my father's scandal behind and start fresh. I said I understood if they wanted me off the team, but I hadn't technically broken any rules. Dominic said I'd broken the most important rule, which was being honest with my teammates. He said trust was essential in a club, and I'd destroyed that trust by hiding who I was. The other members of the core group started arriving and demanded to know what was happening. Within minutes, everyone knew my secret, and the room divided between those who thought I should leave and those who thought I should stay. Aisha spoke up and said she didn't care about my past or my father's crimes. She said I was a good chess player who could help the team succeed, and that's what mattered. Pablo agreed and said my personal history wasn't relevant to my ability to represent the school. But Dominic had the majority on his side, and he called for another vote on my membership. This time, the vote was 8-4 against me remaining in the club. Mr. Leopold said he couldn't override a democratic vote of the club members, and I was officially removed from the team. I walked out of the classroom with Aisha following me into the hallway. She apologized and said this was wrong, but there was nothing she could do. I told her it was fine, and I understood. I'd expected this to happen eventually. That evening, the lawyer called and said he'd managed to delay my deposition by 2 weeks, but the judge was insisting I testify eventually. He said Lawrence Finch had been asking questions around town about me, and had apparently been the one who leaked my identity to the school. My mother asked if we should move again, and the lawyer said that would look suspicious and might make things worse legally. He suggested I keep my head down and avoid any publicity that might draw more attention. I mentioned that I'd just been kicked out of the chess club, and he said that was probably for the best, since competing in tournaments would have generated the exact kind of attention we were trying to avoid. The next few days at school were brutal. Students who'd never cared about chess suddenly had strong opinions about whether I should have been allowed to compete. Someone created a poll on social media asking if it was fair for a grandmaster to play in high school tournaments, and it got hundreds of responses. The local newspaper ran a story about the chess scandal at Lincoln High with quotes from Dominic saying I'd misrepresented myself and violated the trust of my teammates. The article mentioned my father's arrest in Russia and the embezzlement charges, even though those had nothing to do with chess. My mom got called by her work supervisor and told to take a few days off until things calmed down. I stopped going to school for a week and studied online using makeup work the teachers sent home. My mom said we couldn't afford another move, and I needed to face this eventually. I spent my time playing chess online using anonymous accounts, destroying opponents who had no idea they were playing against someone who'd beaten world champions. The games were hollow victories that meant nothing, but at least they were something. I replayed the games from my club tournament and thought about how different things would have been if I'd just played badly and stayed in the middle of the pack. Maybe hiding my ability had been even more important than hiding my identity. Lawrence Finch showed up at our apartment again, and this time he had different questions. He asked if I'd be interested in testifying against my father instead of for him, saying the prosecutors would offer protection and possibly even witness relocation if I cooperated. I said I had nothing to testify about because I didn't know anything, and he said everyone knew something if they looked hard enough. My mother threatened to call the police if he didn't leave, and he handed her his business card, saying the offer would remain open for another week. After he left, I told my mom I was done running from my father's mistakes, and maybe it was time to just face everything head on. The regional qualifier happened on a Saturday, and I wasn't there. Lincoln High sent their 6 players and finished in 4th place, not qualifying for state. Aisha came in 2nd place individually and earned a spot at state finals as an individual competitor. She texted me the results and said the team had missed having me there. Dominic had played terribly according to her, losing 3 of his 5 games and looking rattled the entire time. Trevor had done okay, but nothing special. She said the whole team had been dealing with questions about me, and it had affected their performance. I congratulated her on qualifying for state and asked if she wanted to practice together sometime. She said yes, and we scheduled a meeting at the public library where no one from school would see us. Aisha and I met 3 times a week at the library, playing through classical games and analyzing positions together. She was hungry to improve and absorbed everything I taught her about pawn structures, piece coordination, and long-term planning. I showed her how to calculate forcing variations and when to trust intuition versus when to calculate precisely. Her game improved noticeably within 2 weeks. She asked why I'd never mentioned being a grandmaster, and I explained that my father had used my chess success to build his reputation while secretly committing crimes. I'd wanted to separate myself from all of that and just be normal for once. She said normal was overrated, and I should be proud of what I'd accomplished. The state finals were 3 weeks away when Mr. Leopold called me at home. He said the State Chess Association had received complaints about my exclusion from the Lincoln High team and wanted to investigate whether the school had violated any regulations. Apparently, several other schools had heard about what happened and were arguing that if I'd been allowed to compete, it would have created an unfair advantage for Lincoln High. Other schools were saying the opposite, that excluding me based on my past accomplishments was discriminatory. The whole situation had turned into a political mess with coaches and administrators arguing about eligibility rules that had never been properly defined. Mr. Leopold said the association wanted to interview me about what had happened. I met with 3 officials from the State Chess Association in a conference room at the school district office. They asked about my chess background, and I gave them the complete history. Grandmaster title at 14, tournament victories against world champions, studies under Viktor Kovalenko, competition in 12 countries. They asked why I hadn't disclosed this when joining Lincoln High's club, and I explained about my father's arrest and my family's need for privacy. One official said that made sense, but another said high school sports had disclosure requirements for exactly this reason. The third official pointed out that chess wasn't technically a sport and therefore didn't fall under those same regulations. They thanked me for my time and said they'd make a decision within the week. The decision came 5 days later, in an official letter addressed to Lincoln High School. The State Chess Association had ruled that I'd been eligible to compete for Lincoln High all along, and that the club had violated my rights by voting to exclude me based on my skill level and background. However, since the regional qualifier had already happened and Lincoln High had failed to qualify as a team, the ruling was essentially symbolic. The letter went on to say that the association was establishing new guidelines requiring all high school chess clubs to disclose any players with international ratings or professional titles, but those guidelines wouldn't take effect until next season. Mr. Leopold called to tell me the news and said I was welcome to rejoin the club for next year if I wanted to. I said I'd think about it, but honestly didn't know if I wanted to be part of a group that had turned on me so quickly. Aisha called and said the ruling had caused more division in the club, with some members saying they'd been vindicated and others saying the state association was overstepping its authority. Dominic had apparently threatened to resign as president if I rejoined, and Trevor was supporting him. The club was falling apart over something that should have been simple. A student who wanted to play chess should be able to play chess. But somehow my father's crimes and my past achievements had made everything complicated. I told Aisha I was leaning toward just helping her prepare for state finals and forgetting about the rest of it. We intensified our training sessions with Aisha, now practicing 5 days a week. I taught her my opening repertoire against the most common defenses, and we worked through endgame positions that were likely to appear at the state finals. She was a fast learner and had natural tactical vision that just needed to be refined. Within a few days, she was calculating 3 moves deeper than she'd been able to before and spotting combinations I hadn't explicitly shown her. I realized she had genuine talent that had been held back by the mediocre instruction at Lincoln High. With proper coaching, she could compete at the college level or even beyond. The state finals happened in Portland at a convention center. Aisha's parents drove her up and invited me to come along since I'd been coaching her. My mom agreed to let me go, and we made the 2-hour drive in relative silence. The tournament was organized into 4 divisions by skill level, and Aisha was competing in the second highest division for advanced high school players. The room was filled with hundreds of chess players at dozens of tables, clocks ticking, pieces moving, coaches hovering nearby offering last-minute advice. I sat in the spectator area and watched Aisha play her first game against a senior from a Portland school. She executed the opening perfectly, got a comfortable middle game position, and converted a small advantage into a winning endgame. Her opponent resigned after 40 minutes, and Aisha looked over at me with a huge smile. Her second game was harder against a junior who specialized in tactical complications. The position got wild with both sides attacking each other's kings and material flying off the board. I could see Aisha calculating carefully, using the techniques I'd taught her about evaluating forcing sequences. She found a brilliant queen sacrifice that forced her opponent's king into the open and delivered checkmate within 5 moves. The room burst into applause and several coaches came over to congratulate her. One coach asked who'd taught her that combination, and she pointed at me sitting in the spectator area. The coach came over and asked if I was her private tutor. I said I was just a friend helping her prepare. Between rounds, a tall man in a suit approached me and introduced himself as Dennis Lockwood, a scout for a collegiate chess program. He said he'd been impressed by Aisha's play and wanted to know more about her coaching. I explained that I was just a student from her school who'd been helping her practice. He asked about my own playing background, and I deflected by saying I'd played casually for years. He handed me his card and said if I was interested in coaching or playing at the college level myself, he'd be interested in talking. I thanked him and put the card in my pocket, knowing I'd probably never call him, but appreciating the gesture. Aisha won her 3rd game, and then her 4th, climbing to the top of her division's standings. Other players started noticing her, and coaches were taking photos of her games to analyze later. One coach pulled me aside and said, Aisha's improvement from regional qualifiers to state finals was remarkable, and asked what kind of preparation program she'd been following. I said we'd just been working through classical games and focusing on fundamentals. He said whatever we were doing was working, and asked if I'd consider coaching his players for the summer. I said I'd think about it but didn't give him my contact information. The final round paired Aisha against a senior named Christopher Bell, who'd won the state championship 2 years in a row. He was a tall kid with glasses who carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never lost at this level. The game started with a theoretical duel in the Najdorf Sicilian that went 20 moves deep into known theory before either player made an independent move. Christopher clearly knew his stuff and had prepared extensively. Aisha held her own, but was pushed onto the defensive as Christopher launched a kingside attack with all his pieces. I watched from the spectator area, unable to help, just hoping she'd remember the defensive techniques we'd practiced. The position got critical around move 30 when Christopher sacrificed a knight to expose Aisha's king. She had to calculate precisely to determine whether the sacrifice was sound or just a desperate attempt to create complications. I could see her hand shaking slightly as she moved the pieces on the board in her mind, checking variations. 5 minutes passed on the clock, then 8 minutes. Finally, she made her move, declining the sacrifice and offering a counter-sacrifice of her own. Christopher's eyes widened, and he spent 15 minutes calculating before accepting her piece. The position transformed into a razor-sharp endgame where both sides had winning chances. They reached a position with queens and a few pawns, where every move mattered. Christopher was down to 3 minutes, while Aisha had 5. The time pressure started affecting his play, and he made a small inaccuracy that gave Aisha a winning advantage. She didn't let him off the hook, playing quickly and accurately while Christopher burned through his remaining time trying to find a defense that didn't exist. His clock ran out with the position hopeless, and Aisha had won the state championship. The room erupted in applause, and her parents rushed to the playing area to hug her. Christopher looked shell-shocked, staring at the board like he couldn't believe he'd lost. The award ceremony happened an hour later with Aisha receiving first place in her division and qualifying for the National High School Championship. The tournament director mentioned her incredible improvement and asked if she'd thank her coach publicly. Aisha walked to the microphone and thanked her parents, Mr. Leopold, and then said, "Most importantly, my friend Alexei, who taught me everything I know about chess." The room went quiet, and I saw several coaches looking around trying to figure out who Alexei was. Dennis Lockwood approached me after the ceremony and said he'd done some research during the final round. He knew exactly who I was now and wanted to understand why I was coaching high school players instead of competing myself. I told Dennis the whole story about my father's arrest, our move to America, my need to stay out of the spotlight to avoid attention from investigators and media. He listened without judgment and said he understood the complexity, but thought I was wasting my talent by hiding. He said chess needed players like me, regardless of my family history, and that running from my abilities wasn't going to help anyone. I said I appreciated his perspective, but my priority was keeping my mother safe and not creating more problems for her. He said he respected that, but gave me his card again and told me to call if I ever changed my mind about competing or coaching professionally. On the drive home, Aisha thanked me repeatedly for everything I'd taught her and said she couldn't have won without my coaching. Her parents asked how I'd learned so much about chess, and Aisha admitted that I was actually a grandmaster, which made her father nearly drive off the road. He pulled over and turned around to look at me with wide eyes, asking why a grandmaster was living in Oregon and coaching high school students. I gave them the abbreviated version about my father and our need for privacy. Aisha's mother said she understood and promised they wouldn't spread the information around. Her father said he was grateful I'd helped his daughter, but worried about what this meant for her future competitions if people found out she'd been coached by a professional. The questions about coaching legitimacy came up 3 days later when the tournament director called Aisha's parents. Someone had filed a complaint alleging that Aisha had received professional coaching in violation of amateur status rules. The complainant was anonymous, but everyone assumed it was Christopher Bell's coach who was upset about losing. The state association opened an investigation and requested documentation of all coaching Aisha had received. Her parents called me in a panic asking what to do. I said to tell the truth, that I was just a friend who'd helped her practice and hadn't charged any money. The state association said that didn't matter, that coaching from a grandmaster created an unfair competitive advantage regardless of payment. The investigation took 2 weeks and generated dozens of emails between Aisha's parents, the state association, Mr. Leopold, and various officials. The fundamental question was whether a student could be penalized for receiving informal instruction from a highly skilled friend, or whether that fell under the umbrella of amateur athletics. Some officials argued that Aisha should be stripped of her title and banned from future competition. Others said that was ridiculous because there was no rule against getting help from talented people you knew personally. The debate got heated, enough that the state association scheduled a formal hearing to resolve the issue once and for all. The hearing took place at the state education office with Aisha, her parents, Mr. Leopold, and me, all sitting on one side of a long table. Across from us were 3 association officials and a lawyer representing the organization. They asked me to explain my involvement with Aisha's chess development, and I walked through the timeline of our practice sessions at the library. I emphasized that I'd never charged money, never formally advertised coaching services, and had just been helping a friend improve. The lawyer asked about my professional background, and I admitted my grandmaster status and tournament history. He then argued that my involvement gave Aisha an advantage that other students didn't have and violated the spirit of fair competition in high school chess. Aisha's father stood up and said this was absurd. He asked if students who had parents with PhDs were banned from getting help with their homework, or if students whose parents were musicians couldn't get music lessons at home. He said the state association was creating an arbitrary standard that would punish students for having talented friends or family members. Mr. Leopold added that Lincoln High's chess club had actually voted to exclude me from their team, so if anything, the school had tried to prevent this exact situation from happening. The officials looked uncomfortable and called a recess to deliberate. We waited in the hallway for 90 minutes before being called back in. The decision was split, but ultimately fell in Aisha's favor. The state association ruled that informal coaching from friends or family members was permissible regardless of their skill level, but that going forward, all coaching relationships needed to be disclosed before competition. Aisha would keep her state championship title and could compete at nationals, but she'd need to formally declare me as her coach if I continued helping her. The officials emphasized that this ruling would apply to all future cases and that they were establishing clear guidelines to prevent similar disputes. Aisha's parents were relieved and thanked everyone. As we left the building, one of the officials pulled me aside and said they knew about my situation with my father and weren't trying to make my life harder, but that fairness in competition required transparency even when transparency was uncomfortable. The national championship was scheduled for 5 weeks away in Atlanta, and Aisha asked if I'd continue coaching her. I said yes, but we needed to be smarter about it, meeting at her house instead of in public and keeping our training sessions private. Her parents agreed to host our practices and even set up a dedicated chess room with boards, computers for database research, and a whiteboard for analysis. I started coming over 4 times a week, helping Aisha prepare for the specific opponents she'd likely face at, nationals. We studied their games, identified their weaknesses, prepared customized opening systems to exploit those weaknesses. This was the kind of professional-level preparation I'd received from Victor years ago, and I could see Aisha improving daily. 2 weeks before nationals, Lawrence Finch showed up at our apartment again. This time he had a subpoena requiring my mother to testify about my father's finances. She'd been added to the witness list, despite having repeatedly said she knew nothing about the business. The lawyer said the prosecutors were getting desperate because their case against my father's partners was falling apart and they needed new witnesses. My mother broke down crying and said she couldn't testify because she genuinely didn't know anything useful. I told Finch we'd see him in court and closed the door in his face. My mother said she couldn't afford to keep fighting this, and maybe it was time to just comply and get it over with. The deposition was scheduled for the same week as nationals, meaning my mother would be in legal proceedings while I was supposed to be in Atlanta coaching Aisha. She said I should go to the tournament and she'd handle the deposition alone. I said there was no way I was leaving her to face prosecutors by herself. She said my coaching was important to Aisha, and I'd already sacrificed enough because of my father's mistakes. We argued about it for 2 days before the lawyer called with unexpected news. My father had agreed to testify against his former partners in exchange for a reduced sentence, and the prosecutors no longer needed my mother or me as witnesses. The subpoenas were being withdrawn, and the investigation into our family was officially over. My mother cried with relief and said maybe we could finally start moving forward. We flew to Atlanta with Aisha and her parents, staying at a hotel near the convention center where the national championship was being held. The tournament was enormous, featuring over 300 of the best high school chess players in America competing across multiple divisions. Aisha was in the championship section for the top 50 players, a step up in competition from anything she'd faced before. I spent the days before the tournament analyzing games from her likely opponents and preparing specific strategies for each one. We studied openings, practiced endgames, discussed psychological approaches to handling pressure. Aisha was nervous but focused, absorbing everything I taught her with the dedication of someone who knew this was her chance to prove herself on a national stage. The tournament started with Aisha winning her first 2 games convincingly. She executed the opening preparations perfectly and showed good technique in converting advantages. Her 3rd game was against a player from California who specialized in aggressive attacks and tactical complications. The game got messy with both sides attacking, and I could see Aisha struggling to calculate all the variations. She fought hard, but eventually lost when her opponent found a brilliant sacrifice that crashed through her defenses. After the game, she came to our coaching area looking dejected. I told her the loss was actually good because it showed her where she needed to improve. We spent an hour analyzing what went wrong and how to better handle those types of positions. Aisha responded to the loss by winning her next 3 games, climbing back into contention for a top 10 finish. Her 7th game was against the tournament favorite, a senior from New York named Nathan Cross, who'd been ranked number 1 in high school chess for 2 years. Nathan had a perfect score so far and was expected to win the championship easily. The game attracted a large crowd of spectators and several coaches who wanted to see how Aisha would handle playing against the best. I watched from the coaching area, unable to communicate with her, but hoping she'd remember everything we'd worked on. The game started with Nathan playing a sharp variation of the Sicilian defense that had refuted dozens of opponents. Aisha responded with a new idea we'd prepared specifically for this opening, a pawn sacrifice that led to rich positional compensation. Nathan looked surprised and spent 20 minutes thinking about how to handle the unexpected position. The middle game was complex with both sides having chances, and I could see Aisha calculating deeply on every move. She found several strong moves that kept Nathan under pressure, not letting him consolidate his extra pawn. The position reached a critical point where Aisha had the chance to force a draw by repetition or continue playing for a win. She continued playing, and the crowd murmured with appreciation for her ambition. Nathan defended resourcefully, and the game simplified into an endgame where he was still up a pawn, but Aisha had active pieces and counterplay. They played for another 40 moves in a technical struggle, where both players demonstrated high-level endgame understanding. Eventually, Nathan managed to activate his extra pawn and push it toward promotion. Aisha fought until the very end, but had to resign when Nathan's pawn was unstoppable. Despite the loss, the crowd applauded both players for an impressive game. Nathan came over afterward and told Aisha she'd played brilliantly and would definitely be someone to watch in future tournaments. The compliment from the tournament favorite meant everything to her. Aisha won her remaining games and finished in 8th place nationally, earning recognition as one of the top high school players in America. The awards ceremony celebrated her achievement and mentioned that she was only a junior with another year of eligibility remaining. Several college coaches approached her parents about scholarship opportunities, and Dennis Lockwood from earlier was there representing his program. Aisha thanked me publicly again during her speech, saying that without my coaching, she wouldn't have been able to compete at this level. I stayed in the background, but felt genuine pride in what she'd accomplished. Helping her succeed felt more meaningful than any of my own tournament victories had. On the flight home, Aisha's father asked if I'd be willing to continue coaching her next year to prepare for a run at the national championship. I said I would if circumstances allowed, but that things were still complicated with my family situation. He understood, but said his daughter had real potential, and I was the one who could unlock it. Aisha said she wanted to keep improving regardless of what happened with tournaments and rankings. She said chess had become more than just winning for her. It was about understanding and beauty and pushing herself to think deeper than she'd ever thought before. I recognized that transformation because it's exactly what chess had meant to me before my father's scandal had poisoned everything. Back at Lincoln High, the chess club was in chaos. Dominic had resigned as president after Aisha's national success made his exclusion of me look even worse in retrospect. Trevor and Veronica had also quit the club entirely. Mr. Leopold had called a meeting to reorganize and asked if I'd be interested in joining the leadership. I said I'd join as a regular member, but didn't want any official position. Aisha was elected president unanimously, and she immediately changed the club culture, establishing rules against elitism and requiring experienced players to help coach beginners. The club grew from 12 members to 30 within a month, as word spread that Chess Club was now welcoming to players of all levels. I started teaching group lessons for the club twice a week, covering opening principles, tactical motifs, endgame technique, and chess philosophy. The beginners improved rapidly, and some of the intermediate players started showing real talent. Kevin, who'd lost to me in the first round of that initial club tournament, developed into a solid player who made state finals the following year. Pablo became interested in chess composition and started creating original problems that got published in chess magazines. The club went from being focused on competition to being focused on learning, and the atmosphere changed completely. People actually wanted to be there instead of just attending out of obligation. The state association contacted me in March asking if I'd be interested in coaching the state team for the national team championship. They said they'd investigated my background thoroughly and believed I'd been unfairly excluded from competition but could contribute as a coach instead. I said I'd consider it and talked it over with my mom. She said my father's legal situation was finally resolved with him serving his sentence in Russia and no longer affecting us directly. The prosecutors had moved on to other cases, and the media attention had faded. She said if I wanted to return to chess publicly, she'd support that decision. I accepted the coaching position and started working with the top players from across the state. The national team championship happened in June in Chicago, with state teams competing in a round-robin format. I coached a team of 6 players including Aisha, preparing them for each match and analyzing games between rounds. We finished in 3rd place nationally, the best result for our state in 15 years. The experience reconnected me with the competitive chess world I'd left behind, and several tournament directors approached me about returning to play in adult tournaments. I said I'd think about it but wasn't ready to commit to serious competition yet. Coaching felt safer and more fulfilling than playing because it let me contribute to chess without putting myself in the spotlight. That summer, I started taking students for private coaching, charging reasonable rates that helped my mom with expenses while giving me purpose beyond just hiding from my past. Word spread through the chess community that a grandmaster was coaching in Oregon, and my schedule filled up quickly. I worked with kids as young as 7 and adults as old as 60, helping each of them improve their understanding of chess. Some wanted to compete seriously, while others just wanted to appreciate the game more deeply. I enjoyed both types of students because they reminded me that chess had value beyond just winning and losing. Dennis Lockwood contacted me in August with an offer to coach at his college program with a full scholarship if I also enrolled as a student. I'd be coaching the collegiate team while completing my own degree and could compete in adult tournaments as my schedule allowed. The offer was generous and would let me continue my education while staying involved in chess. I discussed it with my mom, who encouraged me to accept, saying she'd be fine on her own and I needed to start building my future instead of just managing her past. I accepted the position and enrolled for the spring semester, planning to move to campus after finishing the fall term at Lincoln High. My last semester at Lincoln High was bittersweet. The chess club was thriving with 40 members and a waiting list of students who wanted to join. Aisha was preparing for another run at state finals and nationals with confidence that came from genuine skill rather than just natural talent. The culture that had mocked me for joining had been completely transformed into something welcoming and supportive. I thought about how different things would have been if I'd revealed my identity from the beginning instead of trying to hide it. Maybe the honesty would have been better, or maybe the mockery would have just come sooner. Either way, I'd learned that hiding who you are only works until someone finds out, and then you have to deal with the consequences of deception on top of whatever you were hiding in the first place. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.